Mr. Speaker, let me start by placing squarely before the House of Commons and the British public the economic situation facing our country. Much of Europe now appears to be heading into a recession caused by a chronic lack of confidence in the ability of countries to deal with their debts. We will do whatever it takes to protect Britain from this debt storm while doing all we can to build the foundations of future growth. Today, we set out how we will do that by demonstrating that this country has the will to live within its means and keep interest rates low. By acting to stimulate the supply of money and credit to make sure those low interest rates are passed on to families and businesses. By matching our determination on the deficit with an active enterprise policy for business and with lasting investment in our infrastructure and education so that Britain can pay its way in the future. And at every opportunity, helping families with the cost of living. The central forecast we published today from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility does not predict a recession here in Britain. But they have, unsurprisingly, revised down their short-term growth prospects for our country, for Europe and for the world. They expect GDP in Britain to grow this year by 0.9% and by 0.7% next year. They then forecast 2.1% growth in 2013, 2.7% growth in 2014, followed by 3% growth in 2015 and 3% again in 2016. The OBR are clear that this central forecast assumes, in their words, that the euro area finds a way through the current crisis and that policymakers eventually find a solution that delivers sovereign debt sustainability. If they do not, then the OBR warn that there could be a much worse outcome for Britain. I believe they are right. We hope this can be averted. But if the rest of Europe heads into recession, it may prove hard to avoid one here in the UK. We are now undertaking extensive contingency planning to deal with all potential outcomes of the euro crisis. Now, like the Bank of England and the OECD yesterday, the OBR cites the chilling effects of the current instability as one of the central reasons for the reduction in their growth forecast. And I want to thank Robert Choate and his fellow committee members Steve Nicol and Graham Parker and their team for the rigorous work that they have done. I think their forecast today demonstrates beyond any doubt their independence. But if we accept their numbers, this is an important point for the House. If we accept their numbers, we must also pay heed to their analysis. And in addition to the Eurozone crisis, the OBR gives two further reasons for the weaker forecasts. First, what they call the external inflation shock, the result, in their words, of unexpected rises in energy prices and global agricultural commodity prices. Their analysis, independent, is that this explains the slowdown in growth in Britain over the past 18 months. Second, the independent OBR.
Statement by the Chancellor must be heard, and he shouldn't have to fight to be heard. The Chancellor.
Second, Mr. Speaker, the OBR today show new evidence that an even bigger component of the growth that preceded the financial crisis was an unsustainable boom, that the bust was deeper and had an even greater impact on our economy than previously thought. And the result of this analysis is that the OBR have significantly reduced their assumptions about spare capacity in our economy and the trend rate of growth. And this increases their estimate of the proportion of the deficit that is structural. In other words, the part of the deficit that doesn't disappear even when the economy recovers. So our debt challenge is even greater than we thought because the boom was even bigger, the bust even deeper, and the effects will last even longer. Britain has had the highest structural budget deficit of any major economy in the world. and the highest deficit in the entire history of our country outside of war. And the last government left it to this government to sort that mess out. Now, Mr. Speaker, this OBR analysis feeds directly through to borrowing numbers that are falling, but not at the rate that had been forecast. In 2009-10, the last government was borrowing £156 billion a year. During the first year of this government, that fell to £137 billion. This year, the OBR expected to fall again to £127 billion, then £120 billion next year, followed by £100 billion in 2013-14, £79 billion in 2014-15, then £53 billion in 2015-16, and £24 billion a year by 2016-17. However, I can report that because of the lower market interest rates we've secured for Britain, debt interest payments over the Parliament are forecast to be £22 billion less than predicted. The House might also like to know, given the economic events described by the Office for Budget Responsibility, what would have happened to borrowing without the action this government has taken. The Treasury today estimates that borrowing by 2014-15 would have been running at well over 100...
No, I'm sorry, I know the Chancellor is proceeding, but the Chancellor's statement must be heard. There are strong passions on this subject. There will be plenty of time for people to come in on the back of the statement, but the statement must be heard with a degree of courtesy. The Chancellor of the Exchequer.
The Treasury today estimates that borrowing by 2014-15 would have been running at well over £100 billion a year more, and that Britain would have borrowed an additional £100 billion in total over the period. If we had pursued that path, we would now be in the centre of the sovereign debt storm. The crisis we see unfolding in Europe has not undermined the case for the difficult decisions we've taken. It has made that case stronger. We held our deficit reduction budget on our terms last year, not on the market's terms this year, as so many others have been forced to do. In that budget, we set out a tough fiscal mandate that we would eliminate the current structural deficit over the 5-year forecast horizon. And we supplemented the mandate with a fixed debt target that we would get national debt as a proportion of national income falling by the year 2015-16. Now, to be cautious, I set plans to meet both these budget rules 1 year early. That headroom has now disappeared. But I am clear that our rules must be adhered to, and I am taking action to ensure that they are. As a result, the OBR's central projection is that we will meet both the fiscal mandate and the debt target. The current structural deficit is forecast to fall from 4.6% of GDP this year to a current structural surplus of 0.5% in 5 years' time. And the debt to GDP ratio, which is forecast to stand at 67% this year, is now set to peak at 78% in 2014-15 and be falling by the end of the Parliament. So borrowing is falling and debt will come down. It is not happening as quickly as we had wished because of the damage done to our economy by the ongoing financial crisis. But we are set to meet our budget rules and we are going to see Britain through the debt storm. Mr. Speaker, there is a suggestion from some in this House that if you spend more, you will borrow less. This is something for nothing economics, and the House should know the risks that we would be running. Last April, the absence of a credible deficit plan meant our country's credit rating was on negative outlook and our market interest rates were higher than Italy's. 18 months later, we are the only major Western country which has had its credit rating improve. Italy's interest rates are now 7.2%. And what are ours? They are less than 2.5%. Yesterday, we were even borrowing money more cheaply than Germany. And those who would put all that at risk by deliberately adding to our deficit must explain this. Just a 1% rise in our market interest rates would add £10 billion to mortgage bills every year. 1% would mean the average family with a mortgage would have to pay £1,000 more. 1% would increase the cost of business loans by £7 billion. 1% would force taxpayers to find an extra £21 billion in debt interest payments, much of it going to our foreign creditors. In other words, 1% dwarfs any extra government spending or tax cut funded by borrowing that people propose today. And that's the cost of just a 1% rise. Italy's rates have gone up by almost 3% in the last year alone. We will not take this risk with the solvency of the British economy and the security of British families. Mr. Speaker, the current environment requires we take further action on debt to ensure Britain continues to live within its means. This is what we propose to do. First, there is no need to adjust the overall totals set out in the spending review. Taken all together, the measures I will set out today require no extra borrowing and provide no extra savings across the whole spending review period. Second, I am announcing significant savings in current spending to make the fiscal position more sustainable in the medium and long term. But in the short term, over the next 3 years, we will use these savings to fund capital investments in infrastructure, regional growth and education, as well as help for young people to find work. Every pound spent in this way will be paid for by a pound saved permanently. This includes savings from further restraint on public sector pay. For some workforces, the 2-year pay freeze will be coming to an end next spring, and for most during 2013. In the current circumstances, the country cannot afford the 2% rise assumed by some government departments thereafter. So instead, we will set public sector pay awards at an average of 1% for each of the 2 years after the pay freeze ends. Now, many are helped by pay progression, the annual increases in salary grades that many are entitled to, even when pay is frozen. It is one of the reasons why public sector pay has risen at twice the rate of private sector pay over the last 4 years. So while I accept that a 1% average rise is tough, it is also fair to those who work to pay the taxes that will fund it. Mr. Speaker, I am also announcing that we are asking the independent pay review bodies to consider how public sector pay can be made more responsive to local labour markets, and we will ask them to report back by July next year. This is a significant step towards creating a more balanced economy in the regions of our country that does not squeeze out the private sector. Mr. Speaker, departmental budgets. Mr. Speaker, departmental budgets will be adjusted in line with the pay rises I have announced, with the exception of the NHS and the school budgets, where the money saved will be retained in order to protect those budgets in real terms. And this policy will save over £1 billion in current spending by 2014-15. The deal we offer on public sector pensions is also fair to both taxpayers and public servants. The reforms are based on the independent report of John Hutton, a former Labour pension secretary. And he says it is hard to imagine a better deal than this. And I would once again ask the unions why they are damaging our economy at a time like this and putting jobs at risk. Call off the strikes tomorrow, come back to the table, complete the negotiations, and let's agree generous pensions that are affordable to the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to other areas of public spending, starting with overseas aid. This government will stick by the commitments it has made to the poorest people in the world by increasing our international development budget. And the whole House should be proud of the help our country is providing to eradicate disease, save lives and educate children. But the spending plans of the Department for International Development meant that the UK was on course to exceed 0.7% of national income in 2013. That, I don't think, can be justified. So we are adjusting those plans so we don't overshoot the target. Turning to welfare payments, the annual increase in the basic state pension is protected by the triple lock introduced by this government. This guarantees a rise either in line with earnings, prices,